Credit where credit is due. Much of the technical information in this video and some of the photographs are taken from a guidebook to the Wichita Mountains by my friend Charles Gilbert, who has studied the Wichitas all his life and summarized his findings in this very handsome guide published in 2014 by the Oklahoma Geological Survey. Charlie introduced me to the Wichitas almost a decade ago, and I've loved them ever since. I appreciate that introduction and his ongoing pursuit of understanding of a very complex and most interesting igneous province. Although the words Oklahoma and mountains don't fit comfortably together in most people's minds, there are some modest mountain ranges within the state, all of them ancient and therefore very low in topographical profile. Of those ranges, the Wichita Mountains are my favorite by far. They extend from near Lawton to just beyond the town of Granite, about 65 miles to the west-northwest. There are apparent gaps in the range owing to their history. They could accurately be described as a fossil mountain range. They are unlike any other range known to me. As one approaches the Wichitas from most directions, one is struck by the fact that they are accompanied by no foothills. It appears that these granite massifs simply rise directly out of the surrounding plains. The reason for that incongruity is this. The Wichita Mountains present a paleotopography that was carved during the early to mid-Permian period, some 280 to 270 million years ago, subsequently buried in a couple of kilometers worth of sediment as the region subsided, and has more recently been re-exposed by erosion, hence my expression fossil mountain range. The reason there are no foothills surrounding the Wichitas is partly due to the fact that there's still several hundred meters worth of Permian sediment to be removed before the base of them will be exposed. Who knows how many millions of years that will take. The rocks of the Wichitas are, of course, much older than the topography that was carved into them. They were emplaced as gabbroic and granitic batholiths prior to and during the early Cambrian period. The Mount Scott granite, for instance, has been dated to about 534 million years. The sedimentary cover was gradually eroded off those igneous rocks, which were carved into something like their present topographical profile during the early to mid-Permian. Of course, granite mountains don't last 250 million years. The granite's feldspar weathers chemically to clay minerals, liberating the granite's quartz as sand. Most of the clay and sand over the entire planetary surface are the weathering products of granite. Granite mountains are as ephemeral as limestone plateaus. If you want to see something that endures, have a look at the vertically tilted quartzite ridges in the Appalachians of West Virginia and the novaculite ridges exposed in the Marathon Mountains in Texas. The presence of these batholiths is explained by tectonism, which not only runs continents into each other occasionally, but sometimes rips them apart. The East African Rift Valley, where our species evolved, is a good present-day example. The continents are replete with rifts that were active for a time but eventually failed. The extensional motion stopped. These are called allocogens, and the central Oklahoma allocogen is prominent among them. The Earth's crust thins at spreading centers, and magma tends to well up as at the planet's mid-ocean ridges. If the magma happens to be silica-rich, it will either be trapped well beneath the surface, where it gradually cools and crystallizes as the granitic minerals quartz and feldspar, or erupt explosively onto the surface. Silica is sticky, and rhyolitic and andesitic volcanoes are the most violent of all because the gases tend to get trapped in the silica-rich magma and build up into enormous bubbles whose pressure finally overwhelms the confining material that surrounds them. The Wichita Mountains represent an upwelling of silica-rich magma at just such a spreading center, evidences of which can be found from near Dallas to well north of Amarillo. The region of the Wichita Mountains during this rifting attempt, a process that began around 600 million years ago, probably resembled the current Rio Grande Rift in New Mexico, a region dotted with cinder cones and basalt flows. My day trips to the Wichitas usually begin with an exit from I-44 onto Oklahoma 49, which takes me through the ultra-charming town of Medicine Park and into the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge near Mount Scott, the second highest peak in the Wichitas and the only one with an auto road winding around it all the way to the summit. Medicine Park is an old resort town built along a small river that cuts straight through the granite. More on this in just a moment. Just upstream, that river has been dammed to create a recreational lake. Most of the older houses and commercial buildings in Medicine Park, and quite a few in the nearby vicinity, are of a most unusual masonry construction. The spherical boulders of granite that litter the ground in this region have been gathered and rotated into still soft exterior walls of formed concrete. Those rounded boulders are not the products of mechanical weathering in streams. They were chemically weathered underground as rainwater, always slightly acidic, seeped down through the granite's joints and ate away at the feldspar from the corners inward. So long as the rate of weathering exceeds the rate of erosion, those boulders will continue to form beneath the water table. Now, about that river that cuts through granite. Rivers don't ordinarily cut through mountains, they flow around them. There is a relatively rare phenomenon known as stream capture that can result in the appearance of a river having cut through a mountain, but that is not the explanation for the case at hand. The only way a river can actually cut through a mountain is if the river doesn't know that the mountain is there. My apologies for the anthropomorphism, but I don't know any better way to express it. After the final uplift of the region, now covered in thousands of feet of Permian period sandstone and evaporite deposits, the rivers began to course across those vast plains, always following the way of least resistance. If the stream gradient is sufficiently steep, the river will continue down-cutting even when it encounters bedrock because, of course, it's trapped within its own floodplain. That's precisely what happened in this case. Just west of Medicine Park and just inside the boundary of the wildlife preserve, there's a small lake to the south of the highway, impounded by a concrete dam across a deep, steep gorge. The excavation of material for the dam exposed a tall granite face lacerated by basaltic dikes. At this location, one can easily see that basalt weathers much more rapidly than granite. In those places where the formation has intersected the surface, deep voids have been left in the granite, voids that were once filled with basalt. The drive up Mount Scott, the type locality for the Mount Scott granite, and particularly the view from the summit, is always a treat. To the north can be seen a vast and growing wind farm whose wind generators cap virtually every prominence in the Slick Hills. To the south is the Carlton Rhyolite. To the west stretches the bulk of the Wichita Range, finally disappearing from view on the far horizon. To the immediate west lies Mount Sheridan, one of the most distinctive profiles of the range. At its gabbroic base lies the little town of Mears, famous for its restaurant and also for the recently active fault that bears its name. To the immediate southwest is a region carved by ancient rivers. This paleotopography is being reused by modern streams. Just above those ancient river channels lies the Post Oak conglomerate, a melange of weathered granite boulders and the sandy clay that is the end product of that weathering. The Mears Fault is an ancient thrust fault that has been reactivated in Quaternary times, a slippage that occurred 1100 years ago, resulting in a 3-meter vertical offset must have generated a magnitude 7.0 earthquake in the vicinity. For many visitors to the Wichita Mountains, the protected wildlife furnish the principal entertainment. A large herd of American bison roamed the grasslands along with longhorn cattle, prairie dogs, and at least 2 large villages, both indigenous and migratory waterfowl. There are about a dozen small lakes within the boundaries of the refuge, and the native reptiles and arthropods. Here's an item of interest. The American bison that now replace the original populations that were driven to extinction in much of the West are all descended from that herd in the Wichitas. Like most large igneous provinces, the Wichita Mountains boast several pegmatites. One is near the Quartz Mountain Conference Center north of Altus. That pegmatite has yielded some very fine quartz and feldspar crystals along with some rarer minerals. I have seen evidence of the small but well-defined pegmatite in gabbroic anorthosite in an arroyo that runs through the Glen Mountains layered complex in the central part of the range. I've also seen large pyroxene crystals in this gabbro and weathered voids that apparently once held crystals of olivine. My collecting instincts often lead me to alluvial deposits, and these are plentiful on the western edge of the Wichitas. Here, the material that contributes to the Wichita's remaining cover has washed in from locations far to the west, namely the ancestral Rockies, not to be confused with the current Rockies, which were raised as recently as 60 million years ago. That material includes quartzite from those ancient mountains and copious amounts of feldspar and silicified wood. The quartzite is mostly micaceous, which says something about the constitution of the sandstone from which it was formed. That area also yields uncountable myriads of small claystone geodes whose interior cavities are lined with tiny calcite crystals. In some areas, the crystalline and granular forms of gypsum, selenite and alabaster respectively, are abundant, littering the surface. I have seen a block of alabaster to the west of Mangum that is roughly the size of a small house, fallen out of a road cut. I want to close this account by relating an experience that I once had northwest of the Quartz Mountain Conference Center, not far from the small town of Granite, appropriately named for a large granite quarry nearby, whose primary economic engine these days seems to be a maximum security penitentiary. I was combing a deeply eroded area north of Lake Altus-Lugert for claystone geodes and interesting alluvia when I happened upon a pile of red granite just like the rock that comprises the bulk of the Wichitas in that vicinity. My first thought was that someone had inexplicably dumped a truckload of granite in this remote location. But a little reflection showed me just how nonsensical my immediate explanation was. There are no roads leading to that pile of granite, and there is simply no scenario I can think of that would explain why someone would do that. I trekked back to my car, which was parked on a primitive road perhaps a quarter of a mile away, to get my rock hammer, and returned to the pile, whose top was roughly level with my eyes. I began to pull away pieces of the granite and discovered that the farther into the pile I went, the greater the integrity of the structure. In other words, this was not a pile of granite at all. It was the tip of a mountain peak whose base lay several hundred meters underfoot. My dawning awareness was, all in all, a humbling and ennobling experience.